Okay, I hope that Lee has answered all of your questions. Can you hear me in the back?
Yes.
Okay. Here today and gone tomorrow. Honeybee colony collapse. First of all, let me explain that this title is just a little bit misleading. Yes, I will talk a little bit about honeybees and about colony collapse disorder, but that is not the only focus of my presentation here this evening, and maybe not even the main focus. I will talk about various other things. If you came with the intention of hearing every detail about honeybees, and if you came wanting to have all of your questions about colony collapse answered, then you may be disappointed. And having said that, I'm going to pause for just a minute. And if you like, now you may stand up and leave. I assure you that your entrance fee will be fully reimbursed. Okay, let's talk about colony collapse disorder a little bit, get that out of the way. Colony collapse disorder, often shortened as CCD, is a phenomenon that got a lot of media attention about 5 years ago. All sorts of media, newspapers, radio, TV, all sorts of things were reporting on this. Initially, some of the researchers, they wondered if this is really something that was new, or if it's something that had been around for a long, long time, and because of the media coverage, it was just being reported more often, maybe noticed more often. Maybe there was some of that, but it didn't take long before people realized that, yes, there really was something going on here, something that was much more prevalent than before. Now, what is the explanation? I don't know. I don't think that anybody at this point knows for sure. There have been a lot of possible explanations that have been forwarded. You may have heard about the microwave explanation, that waves produced by cellular telephones and the such, they disorient the bees. They keep the bees from getting back to their hive. Now this picture here is also a little misleading. That doesn't depict colony collapse at all. You see, what happens is you'll have a colony that's apparently in pretty good health, and then you come back a short time later, and a large percentage of the workers are just not there. The mystery is, where have they gone? You don't even find the carcasses like I have depicted here. Where have they gone? Well, the microwave explanation, that may come into, well, at least it's a explanation. Explanations that are more widely accepted include things like environmental stresses, environmental contamination, pesticides in the environment, diseases. All sorts of things have been suggested as possible explanations for the collapse disorder. In reality, it's probably not a single factor that leads to the disorder, but a combination of more than one thing. Some of you may have been aware of these recent news releases that came out just a week or two ago. What does it say there? Scientists and soldiers solve a bee mystery. This is a New York Times article here, a news release. Other media have also reported on this. These reports are based on an actual scientific article that was published just a couple weeks ago, where entomologists, in cooperation with military personnel, entomologists discovered that two diseases in tandem with each other, a viral disease and the nosema disease, which is a microsporidian. These two diseases, when they both attack the colony together, you will get the symptoms that we call colony collapse disorder. Now, is this the full story? Is this the last explanation? Well, I don't know. We'll wait and see. But in my mind, it maybe is the most believable of all of the explanations that have been forwarded. Okay, now let me talk just a little bit about honeybees. Honeybees are animals. They're not plants. They're insects. Within the insects, they belong to the large order Hymenoptera. These are things such as sawflies, ants, bees, wasps. Within the Hymenoptera, they belong to the family Apidae. Apidae include not only the honeybees, but also bumblebees, and in a broader sense, even carpenter bees and digger bees, like you can see depicted by a couple of these illustrations. Within the Apidae, we have the genus Apis. These are the honeybees. And I'll talk a little bit about some of the characteristics, just a few things about the genus Apis. First of all, it's not a single species. There are several. All of the living species, all of the extant species, are native to the Old World. None of them occurring in North America, except that the European species, Apis mellifera, has been introduced here, as well as to practically every other part of the world. Let me talk for just a minute about the stinger of a honeybee. Most of you have maybe heard at some time that only female bees sting. Well, that is the case. The stinger is a modified ovipositor. Ovipositor is just a fancy name for egg-laying organ. In bees, only females lay eggs. Only females have an ovipositor. Only females can sting. Now, you really can't see it in this illustration, but the stinger of honeybees, bees in the genus Apis, is quite unique. It's barbed. It's barbed in such a way that when the bee stings, that stinger is permanently secured inside the flesh of the attacker, of the person or animal that is being stung. That's actually a device that enables the sting to be more potent than it would be otherwise. As a worker bee stings, typically it will pull away, leaving part of its intestine behind, and yes, the bee will die shortly after that. But as the stinger is left behind, the venom sac is also left behind, along with muscles that continue to contract and to force venom into the wound. It makes the sting more potent. Suppose that a person is stung. Well, the natural reaction is that you want to grab that stinger as quickly as possible and pull it out. Well, that's probably not the best thing to do. When you do that, you pinch it, you pinch that venom gland, and you actually force all of that poison into you at once. Not a good thing to do. Look at the eyes of a honeybee. Bees in the genus Apis, they do have setose eyes, hairy eyes. To my knowledge, they're the only bees that have this. And I'll mention this very briefly later on in my presentation. Bees do all sorts of neat things, and I'm not going to talk about all of them. They're wonderful creatures. We could go on for hours and days and weeks. But let me just mention one or two things that are of benefit to us. Honey is great. I certainly enjoyed the honey upstairs. I hope you did too. There you see some of the comb. The wax is used for various things. Even the venom of honeybees is useful. It has some medicinal purposes. Above all, honeybees are absolutely incredible pollinators. Just think of this. Isn't it amazing that there's that there's a species that you can have in a box, thousands of individual pollinators in a box. You can move that box around from place to place where pollination is most needed. Really, really wonderful stuff here. Modern agriculture is in large part dependent on these honeybees. Without it, we wouldn't have a lot of the wonderful things that we eat. Most of the fruit and vegetables would not be produced, at least in the numbers that we're able to do now, without the help of honeybees. Beekeeping has been around a long, long time. As much as 4,000 to 5,000 years ago, the ancient Egyptians were already very adept beekeepers. The ancient Egyptians actually loved honey, and they revered the honeybee. They used the honeybee as an iconic symbol for Egypt. You see, Utah is not the first in that. Now, in a minute or two, I'm going to talk a little bit about breeding of domesticated animals, and honeybee is a domesticated animal. But I ought to say a little bit about Africanized honeybees. We breed all sorts of traits into our domesticated animals, things that are hopefully desirable, but on occasion we make a mistake. Back in the mid-1950s, Brazilian researchers were hoping to breed some traits into the European strain of honeybees. They were hoping to breed traits into them that would make them better adapted to tropical conditions. They went over to Africa, got some wild stock there, same species as the European honeybee, Apis mellifera, the same species, but again, wild stock, brought it back to Brazil, and the intention was to do some investigations there. But it wasn't there long before the bees escaped captivity and immediately interbred with the European strain, and voila, you have Africanized honeybees. It's interesting that early on in my entomological career, I had some doubts about just how nasty these bees are. That probably is a result of an early experience I had. You see, many years ago, back in late 1970s, early 1980s, I was on a research trip in South America, collecting the beetles that I study, and just by chance I happened to wander into a bee yard. And it looked like a great place to collect my beetles, and so I went about my business, being a little bit careful to stay out of the flight path of the bees, of course, but went about my business and had no problem whatsoever. Later on that same week, I was at the university down there talking to an entomologist, and I asked him about the Africanized bee, the thing that down there they call la abeja asesina, or the assassin bee. I asked him about the assassin bee, and the response came back that all of the bees in the area were at least to some degree Africanized, and that they just learned to deal with them. Now, this was probably bad information, I'm sure it was. But based on that experience, I was a skeptic as to just how nasty the bees were. And I thought, when people talk about how aggressive these things are, it's probably coming from entomophobic people that go berserk every time any insect gets close to them. And I kept that opinion for years and years, up until just 4 or 5 years ago, when I ran into some true Africanized bees in southern Nevada. And after running away from them, perhaps a quarter mile away, being stung all the way along, I became an instant believer. These are nasty, nasty, nasty guys, as the many stingers in the face of this lady, as they suggest to you. They're not guys you want to deal with. Now I want to change the direction of my presentation for just a few minutes. I want to talk about species conservation. And you say, well, how is that related? I'll come back to honeybees in a few minutes. But let's talk about species conservation. Nowadays, people in general, and especially biologists, we talk about the countless species that are going extinct every day. Every day there are many, many, many species that, for various reasons, go into extinction. They no longer survive. They are no more. A great number of these things are insects. Consider that half of the things that have ever been named, half of the animals, plants, fungi, everything, half of the organisms that have ever been named are insects. There's a huge number of them. So when we talk about extinction, in great part, we're talking about insect extinction. As I talk a little bit about this, I don't want you to get the wrong impression. I am not pushing for the idea of increased regulation, protecting these things. One of the big problems that researchers have nowadays is the awful bureaucracy we have to go through to try and study an insect. But at the same time, I am pushing for, or I am hoping to demonstrate that the conservation of species is important to us. Now you might say, if most of these things, or a good number of these things, are insects, and they're going extinct, why do we care? It's just a bug. Why are they important? Some of you may be familiar with this movie, starring Shawn Connery and who's that lady? Lorraine Bracco, Medicine Man. The basic plot is that there's a scientist, Shawn Connery, down somewhere in tropical America, and he notices that the native people do not suffer from cancer. And talking with the native villagers, they tell him that no one in the village has ever died from cancer. More than just that, they tell him that there is a secret substance in the forest that protects them from cancer. Through most of the movie, Shawn Connery does all he can to try and find this secret cure for cancer, this thing that prevents cancer. He tests the various plants, he tests all sorts of things without any success. Now the rest of the plot is that the forest is being destroyed. And right towards the end of the movie, yes, the loggers come in and they completely clear cut the forest, destroy the entire area, destroy the trees, the plants, and all of the animals associated with the forest. Well, the poor Shawn Connery, he goes back to his laboratory, and just by chance he notices that some foraging ants, some worker caste ants, have entered his laboratory. You know, ants often get into places where often we don't want them to be. And they actually contaminate his samples of cancer cells. And he notices that those cells immediately die off. He has found the cure. But all that's left of that species is workers, sterile workers. That species is, for all intents and purposes, that ant species is extinct. Well, this is a Hollywood movie. How far-fetched is this? A few years ago, I was invited to go down to Costa Rica. And who invited me? A pharmaceutical company. They invited me, and they paid my expenses to go there. They asked me to go to a large collection of insects down there and identify the beetles in that collection. Why in the world were they interested in the beetles, and why in the world were they interested in getting them identified? Well, the pharmaceutical investigators down there, they were doing essentially the same sorts of studies that Shawn Connery in the movie was doing. They were trying to find medicinal uses of substances that came from the forest. Not only things that could be used against cancer, but things that might have other biological activity, perhaps substances that could be useful in diabetes and all sorts of things. Now, why were they interested in getting their insects identified? Let's just suppose, and I'm not sure how close to the truth this is. I know that they did find some useful substances in their investigations. I don't know what they found. It's all sort of top secret. But let's suppose that they did find a beetle, that the beetle secreted a liquid, and they tested that in an assay against cancer cells, and they discovered that the substance very, very slightly slowed the growth of those cancer cells. Well, where are they going to want to go from there? What sorts of questions are they going to ask? One of the questions they're going to ask is, what are the closely related animals? Is there something else closely related to this beetle that also produces a secretion that is not identical but chemically similar? Maybe that secretion also has some activity against cancer cells, and maybe they really do a bang-up job. Now, I hope I've illustrated with this that the importance is that, yes, even a tiny little bug is important to us. There are all sorts of other reasons beyond these medicinal uses. There are all sorts of other reasons why insects are important to us. Insects aren't out there all on their own. Species interact with each other. When one species is eliminated from an ecosystem, it has effects on everything else nearby, and ultimately, even on human beings. Let me talk for just a minute about breeding of domesticated species. We do all sorts of things to select for traits in our domesticated animals, things that for one reason or another we think we like, things that we say are desirable. But in doing so, sometimes we don't pay much attention to other characteristics that really enable that species or that individual to do well under natural situations. Consider this thing, whatever that is. It's almost a dog. Consider that thing. If that were to be away from the pampering of human beings and placed out in a wild situation, I wondered just how long that would survive. Let me talk about another aspect of animals and plants, things in general. What about abundance? There are some things that are incredibly abundant. Does that mean that they're immune from extinction? Consider for just a minute the American bison. It used to be super abundant. It's still around, you can see them, but not so plentifully as before. Some of you are familiar with this guy here. That's a passenger pigeon. Those things used to be so abundant that in some areas they were considered nuisances. Now it's absolutely extinct. So just because something is common doesn't necessarily mean that it's immune from extinction. Now here's a diagram. That line going across the middle of the United States, that's kind of an arbitrary line. But I put it up there to talk a little bit about why some species are distributed where they are, and why some species are very, very limited in their distribution. Let's look at that line, and let's suppose let's say that has something to do with temperature. Maybe that's the average daytime temperature during the month of July. Now suppose that there's a species that is sensitive to temperature and needs the warmer temperatures. That species would only occur below that line, to the south of that line. Would not occur north of that line. Let's look at another diagram here. That again is just an arbitrary line, but let's say that indicates maybe annual rainfall. And maybe there's a species that is sensitive to rainfall, needs a lot of moisture in the area where it can live. Those species would only occur to the right, to the east of that line. Now let's look at those two diagrams together. Let's suppose that there's a species that is sensitive both to the temperature and to the rainfall. That cuts down the area where that species can survive. In this instance, it would only survive in the lower right corner or the lower right quadrant of that diagram in the southeast part of the U.S. In reality, we could continue to put more and more and more lines on this diagram. Some of them could be related, well, maybe to temperature in another way, maybe to lowest temperature during the winter time. Other lines could be related to soil type. Other lines could be related to elevation. Other lines could be related to maybe distribution of a food plant is something that they use. Other lines could be related to distribution of a natural enemy, distribution of a parasite or a predator. But I think you start to get the idea that all of these factors together determine where a species can survive. Nowadays, you hear a lot about changing environment, things like global warming, and I'm not going to argue for or against these things, whether or not it's something that is or is not happening. But let's just consider global warming for an example here. Some people naively would say, well, as the Earth starts to warm up, some of these southern species, as temperatures get higher, they would simply move farther north, and they would do well. Well, that is a naive way of looking at things. Remember that there are many, many, many factors. Temperature is only one. As species would move north, other factors would not be conducive to their survival. Certainly, a huge number of these things would go extinct. Now let's return to a minute or two back to the honeybee. I've been talking about extinction. Is the honeybee in danger of extinction? I don't think so. I think it's a long ways off. But let's consider a couple of things. Honeybee is a domesticated animal. We've selected for all sorts of things. Sometimes in our selection for various traits, sometimes we overlook traits that enhance the survivability of a species, and it is more susceptible that way. So the pure fact that it's a domesticated creature, maybe that's a strike against it. Now, as quickly as I say that, let me also say that right now, in recent years, there's probably more genetic variability in the genome of honeybees than there has been in hundreds of years. But just how much of that variability is going to be useful to survival, I don't know. Honeybees are super abundant. They're essentially ubiquitous. Everywhere in the world, except for in ocean areas and in the polar regions, everywhere in the world you're going to find honeybees, domesticated European strain honeybees, and they're going to be abundant. Does that mean that they're not susceptible, that they're entirely immune to extinction? Well, again, remember the bison and the passenger pigeon. What's this thing? This is a fossil that was found in Nevada just a few years ago. I look at that thing and it looks like a smudge on a rock to me. It doesn't look like much, but you know, paleontologists, they have great imaginations, and they can actually read something out of that. More than imaginations, they're really adept at looking at something like this and making sense out of it. Now, it wasn't a single fossil that was found. It's quite a number of them. And by looking at these fossils, they notice several things of interest. First of all, the wing venation is essentially identical to that of species in the genus Apis. These things have barbed stingers. They have vesitos, the hairy eyes. These things are honeybees. Now, for most of my life, I was told that honeybees were native only to the Old World. Probably some of you have heard that too in various settings. But here is a honeybee from Nevada. Indeed, just a year or two ago, this scientific paper was published, a new species of honeybee from Nevada. Now, I don't know how abundant this extinct species was. I really don't know. Maybe it was abundant and found all over the place, more than just in Nevada. I don't know. Maybe it was very limited in distribution. I don't know. But at least consider this. At one time, there was a honeybee species that occurred natively in North America. It does not anymore. European domesticated honeybee is ubiquitous now. It's found all over the place. Is there any possibility that it also could go extinct? We have a precedence here. There was a species here in North America, no longer here. Is there a possibility that even the domesticated honeybee could be gone at some point? Don't know. Don't know. I don't know. I don't think that's very likely, but consider that environment is changing. There are stresses of all sorts of types on the honeybee. Things like this colony collapse disorder, things that are attacking honeybees now that were essentially unknown just a few years ago. I don't know. Honeybees, possibly here today and gone tomorrow. Thank you for your attention.